Hello and welcome to the ninth and last episode of this module on capitalism, commodification, and consumerism. And I talked a lot about the notion of Iḥsān as a state of consciousness that allows you to reappropriate your agency in an alienated context and alienated life that is superimposed upon everyone now in the world due to the structures of capitalism and consumerism and the commodification of everything. And I suggested that consciousness allows for a purposiveness. That purposiveness gives or reclaims the agency of the individual in as much as it is sensitive to the context of individual experience. This is number one. So again, to recap what I said you are experiencing a moment of defeat. So you think about God as the all-powerful, al-Qahhar, and the all-dominating. And or you are experiencing a moment of beauty and ecstasy, ecstatic beauty, so you refer to God as the all-beautiful, and so on. And through that absolute, you reinterpret, you reinterpret the meaning and purpose of the experience that you were going through your own understanding of that particular manifestation of the absolute or the necessary existent in that particular context. That also allows for a new view of matter, because matter is not simply there for objectification and commodification. It is there to serve a purpose, and it is there to stand on its own, actually. There is a respect for matter as it is, and by matter here I mean the physical characteristics, the crude, sheer manifestation of the material in all of its sensible dimensions. And I think many modern artists and architects, especially minimalists, for instance, would talk about the respect for matter as it is and the attempt not to superimpose any symbols on matter in their architecture or in their artistic formations, and accept it as it is. So you accept matter for the matter of the whatever object you are dealing with, but you see that it is in your consciousness. That this is why I have been stressing Iḥsān as a state of consciousness, whether Iḥsān as mushahada or as ikhlas. And again, I'm using to use the language of Ibn Rajab al-Hanbali, the great scholar, for instance. Whether you are in whichever state of Iḥsān, but of course in the state of mushahada, you are giving a purpose in your consciousness without actually superimposing it on matter, whether through a particular formation that you superimpose on matter, just like, for instance, we draw symbols, or we take a piece of stone and we carve it in a particular way, or the way we exploit matter for the purposes of capitalism, which we have been doing for centuries now. No, you see the matter and you see something beyond it in your state of consciousness. Now, if that state of consciousness is afforded, and I think there is a way in which we can do that, and there are many methods in which you can train your consciousness to think in that way, and to attune your state of mind in that way. I think that will also lead to a radical change in which we relate to objects around us, and we relate to commodities, and it will relate also to our consumption behaviors. I find it sometimes extremely depressing when I find that many Muslims, for instance, are taking certain traditions of the Prophet to justify greed, like for instance the famous hadith of أن تترك ورثتك أغنياء, to leave your posterity rich is better than leaving your posterity poor and in need of other people. Yes, the Prophet did say something like did say that. If that tradition, I mean, as far as I know, it's a strongly narrated tradition. So the matn and isnad, in terms of matn and isnad, as far as I know, but this hadith has to be taken within the context of so many other things that the Prophet and the Quran said about not being greedy, about being good to nature and the creatures of God, and about being humble and being modest in your consumption and in your pursuit of wealth, and realizing that all wealth is actually God's wealth, and that you are only using it, and so on and so forth. So I think that state of consciousness is bound to affect human behavior. Last but not least, I think it is also bound to make us reclaim many of the social relations that has been commodified, including marriage, including our friendships with people, including many other phenomena. Because again, I think it's all about states of mind. It's all about how you perceive of your partner, for instance, in a marriage. Okay, do you see that partner as an added thing to a bigger picture in life that is all about, that conceives of yourself and your agency as an object in pursuit of richness and accumulation of wealth? Okay, or you see that there is a purpose, and that purpose is related to your rational faith, and that purpose, which is more important, and that rational faith is not only important for merely religious aspects that are superimposed and restricts how you can have fun and pleasure in your life. No, it is important to reclaim your own agency that was lost by the impositions of capitalism on our life. By the way, capitalism took, as Marx brilliantly said 200 years ago, and I discussed earlier, it takes away from us the relationship to products, to the things we create in life, and so on and so forth. So it's not only out of a religious aspect. Islam is it's the Islamic notion of Iḥsān is there for a humanistic purpose, which is to reclaim your agency, to reappropriate, to use the language Rahel Yeager used, is to reclaim your agency in a certain way. Now, last but not least, and since this series is also about how the Islamic philosophical tradition can speak to contemporary philosophy, and in connection with contemporary dilemmas, I think one of the main thinkers that come to my mind, and I have studied extensively and wrote about in my dissertation, and I find him one of the greatest thinkers of our time. Maybe you have heard me saying that in other episodes before that, in connection with the way I have presented Iḥsān as a purposive state of consciousness, is a great German philosopher of enlightenment, Immanuel Kant. And Kant, in the Critique of Judgment, talks about purposive aesthetic consciousness, and talks about how the idea of God, which he makes several uses of in his system of in his critical system and his understanding on the different modes of subjectivity and the different senses of the self that we employ in different modes of experience, whether the moral or the theoretical or other. But in aesthetics, he makes an argument very similar to the way I interpreted Iḥsān as a purposive aesthetic consciousness. He talks about imagination, just like many of the Arab and Muslim philosophers, just like Ibn al-Arabi in his mystical philosophy, and just like Al-Farabi and Averroes in his psychology. And he talks about the role of imagination in mediating between the purely rational domain of ethics and the natural reality that we or physical reality of our lives. And he talks about how we need to, how imagination can postulate, how imagination can help harmonize both and give purpose to nature. Because he says science doesn't give purpose to nature. Science and scientific laws merely explain natural phenomena, but they do not represent phenomena to our consciousness as a coherent system. And we need that for ourselves. We need to get over fragmentation. And remember, as I referred or as I discussed in the last episode on capitalism and postmodernity, one of the biggest problems that we are living now in that stage of capitalism, of fragmented capitalism and fragmented modernity, fragmented postmodernity, is that the more fragmented you are, the more that you don't feel you have a specific essence, the easier you are as an object for alienation by capitalism. Because this is why now, I studied advertising for a long time, or for some time, I should say, and they always talk about customized products. The more fragmented you are, the easier you can be alienated by capitalism. The easier that you can have products made for you and be convinced that this is what you really need, and this is what you really want, and this is what you have to consume. And I think that despite the many differences between a Kantian framework and the Islamic frame, of course, Kant didn't have a theory of names or any of these things, but I think the idea, when Kant talks about beauty as a symbol of morality, and he talks about God there, and he talks about God as or reason allowing a purposive aesthetic consciousness that interprets or allows for a state of mind and a Bewusstsein, a consciousness that is going beyond the immediate material objective determinations of a particular thing, and at the same time also going beyond the moral commands. In that sense, then we can talk about the domain of fiqh in Islam, and the domain of commands, and the domain of metaphysics, okay, or the domain of Iman and the domain of Islam. And having that aesthetic domain in between allows for, as I said, a state of consciousness that gives purpose without imposing a particular essentialist view either of nature or of the human being, whom we are trying to reclaim from alienation. Because I agree with the thinkers I talked about in the earlier episodes when I was talking about the nature of capitalism, that alienation is just now a diagnostic concept. we are alienated whether we want it or not. It's superimposed on us. Is capitalism ending soon or not? I don't know. And I don't like to go into these speculations. There are many economists who have been saying that for ages now. Whether inside, I mean, I can refer you, for instance, to the very interesting work of the leading American Marxist philosopher, Richard Wolff, who has been talking recently about that. But again, people have been talking about the end of capitalism for a long, long time. And it hasn't ended as of yet. Is there a way out? Will there be major transformations in the political and economic structure of our life and society? God knows. I mean, I do not know for sure. And I leave it for social and political philosophers and economic, or actually better, economists and scholars of economics to predict. Because even though I think it's, from my humble perspective, it's very difficult to predict. But what I was interested in, and this is what I would like to leave you with as I'm concluding this module, is that there is a very interesting idea, which is Iḥsān as a state of mind or consciousness. And there are, within the Islamic tradition, many practices, whether in the Sunnah of the Prophet, that is the tradition or the practices of the Prophet, and by practices here I mean social activities, I mean personal practices, I mean familial ethics related to family life and so on, that corroborate, this is the right word, that support that state of consciousness. And if people take the theory of names, which many reading scholars have talked about, and take the literature on Iḥsān as a state of excellence, and its discussion by many leading scholars, whether those scholars were fuqaha, legal scholars, or theologians, or mystic philosophers and mystics, I think that there is a way in which we can, to use the language that I used earlier by those critics of capitalism, to appropriate our agency and to think of things beyond commodities. That will not be easy. It's a process, but so is the struggle of many critics of the state of alienation that was imposed on us by corporate capitalism, and capitalism for the last 200 years essentially require. Nothing is easy. So, but I thought that Iḥsān is within the context of my discussion of what I take to be the two most deleterious consequences of contemporary capitalism, namely alienation and commodification, is a very interesting way out if we think about it as a purposive state of consciousness where the names of God give a new way in which I can understand my agency and bring my individuality and also be conscious of things around me.